After being cut from his grandfather's will, the only inheritance the veteran Gary received was an old leather dog toy. He thought it was a final insult, but his dog, Rocky, began acting strangely. He didn't tear the object apart like other toys. Instead, he guarded it carefully, growling at anyone who came near, and constantly nudged Gary's hand with his nose as if trying to tell him something. Gary soon realized that this worthless gift was the key to a buried truth, a truth that could either save or destroy everything he held dear. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The air in Mr. Henderson's office was thick with the scent of old paper and quiet grief. It was a formal, suffocating smell, the kind that clung to the dark wood paneling and the leather-bound books that had witnessed 100 other family histories being divided and defined. Gary sat in a stiff-backed chair, his hands resting on his knees, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. Beside him, a quiet, steady warmth pressed against his leg. He glanced down at his companion. Rocky, his German shepherd, lay perfectly still on the worn carpet, his head resting on his paws. At 8 years old, Rocky was in his prime, a magnificent dog whose thick coat was a rare mix of wolf gray and white, a stark contrast to the dark floor. His intelligent amber eyes were fixed on Gary, watching, waiting. He was a silent sentinel, a creature of profound calm who seemed to absorb the tension in the room, leaving a small pocket of peace just for the two of them. Rocky had been a rescue, a dog whose own past was a mystery, but from the moment Gary had brought him home, their bond had been absolute. He was Gary's shadow, his confidant, and now, his only comfort. Gary was a man shaped by discipline and loss. In his early 30s, he carried the lean, wiry strength of his military service in his frame. His short brown hair was already showing distinguished silver at the temples, and his face, though etched with a quiet sorrow, held the kindness of his grandfather in his eyes. He had come home to Sparrow Creek Valley, Montana, seeking the peace he had lost overseas, and he had found it here, on his grandfather Arthur's farm, with Rocky by his side. But now Arthur was gone, and the peace felt fragile, ready to shatter. Across the large mahogany desk, Mr. Henderson, the family lawyer for as long as Gary could remember, cleared his throat. He was a frail man with thinning white hair and a weary expression, as if he carried the weight of every will he'd ever read. As per Arthur Wilson's final will and testament, he began, his voice raspy, we will now proceed with the distribution of the primary assets. Gary's gaze drifted to his cousin, who sat in the chair closest to the desk. David was a few years younger than him, with a softer build and wearing a crisp button-down shirt that looked out of place in the rustic valley. He had always been the practical one, the businessman, his mind focused on profit margins and efficiency, while Gary had been learning the names of the constellations from his grandfather in the open fields. David shifted in his seat, an air of nervous anticipation around him. To my grandson, David Wilson, Mr. Henderson read, his words echoing in the silent room, I bequeath the entirety of the Sparrow Creek Wilson farm. This includes the main farmhouse, all 300 acres of surrounding land, the livestock, and all farming equipment, both modern and antique. The words hit Gary like a physical blow. A cold wave washed over him, and he instinctively reached down, his fingers sinking into the thick fur on Rocky's neck. The dog let out a soft sigh, nudging his head against Gary's hand. He understood. He always did. Gary stared at a point on the wall, seeing nothing, the lawyer's voice fading into a distant drone. The whole farm. Everything he and Arthur had walked, worked, and dreamed on. Every memory, every lesson, every sunset viewed from the porch, all handed to David. He risked a glance at his cousin. David was staring down at his hands, his expression a mixture of profound relief and the slightest hint of guilt as he avoided Gary's eyes. And to my grandson, Gary Wilson, Mr. Henderson continued, turning a page. Gary held his breath, a sliver of irrational hope piercing through his shock. Perhaps there was a separate parcel, a savings account, something. I bequeath the contents of the old line cabin on the northern edge of the property, the lawyer stated, along with all my personal effects contained within. He paused, picking up a sturdy, worn object from beside his desk. Specifically, he wanted you to have this. He held up a handmade leather training dummy. It was old, the dark brown leather softened with age and use, the stitching thick and incredibly sturdy, clearly the work of a skilled craftsman. It was the dummy Arthur had made years ago, the one he and Gary had used to teach Rocky to retrieve. It was a tool, a memory, and, apparently, his inheritance. Mr. Henderson then picked up a small, folded piece of paper. And this note. He passed the items to Gary. The leather felt familiar and heavy in his hands. The note simply had his name, Gary, written on the front in his grandfather's unmistakable, spidery script. The room was silent. Gary could feel the weight of everyone's pity. He was the grandson who had served his country, the one who had spent every summer with Arthur, the one who shared his quiet love for the land, and he had been left with a dog toy. The meeting dissolved quickly after that. Relatives offered him clumsy, comforting pats on the shoulder. David approached him as he stood to leave. "Gary, I had no idea," David said, his voice low. "Look, the cabin is yours, of course. Stay as long as you need. We can work something out. It's fine, David," Gary replied, his voice flat. He didn't have the energy for this. He just wanted to leave. He clipped the leash onto Rocky's collar, and together they walked out of the office, leaving the scent of old paper and broken promises behind. The late autumn air of Montana was crisp and clean, a sharp contrast to the stuffy room. The mountains stood majestically in the distance, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. It was the land he loved, the land he felt connected to, and it was no longer his. He stopped on the sidewalk, looking down at the heavy leather dummy in his hand and the cryptic note in his pocket. A knot of confusion and hurt tightened inside him. This wasn't about the money or the property. It was about what it signified. It felt like a final, cold dismissal from the man he revered most in the world. He felt Rocky press against his leg again, a firm, grounding presence. Gary looked down into those loyal amber eyes and knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. But the question echoed in his heart, a painful, unanswered riddle. Why, Grandpa? Why? The old line cabin stood at the edge of the woods, a silent testament to a simpler time. It was small and sturdy, built from the very timber that surrounded it, and smelled of pine resin, cold ash, and a century of Montana seasons. As Gary pushed open the heavy wooden door, a sliver of dusty sunlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a space untouched by the modern world. Rocky entered first, his nails clicking softly on the floorboards as he did a slow, quiet patrol of the single room. Everything was just as he remembered. The worn armchair where his grandfather Arthur used to sit, a half-finished whittled bird still resting on the small table beside it. The stone fireplace, the neat stack of books on the mantelpiece, the faded photograph of a smiling young woman who he knew was his grandmother, Eleanor. Gary ran a hand over the rough wooden table in the center of the room, his heart aching with a fresh wave of grief. This place was a vessel of memories, each object a touchstone to a past that now felt impossibly distant. He remembered being a small boy in this cabin, hiding from a summer thunderstorm while Arthur told him stories of the Crow people who once called this valley home. He remembered learning how to tie fishing flies at this very table, his clumsy fingers guided by his grandfather's patient, calloused hands. Arthur had taught him that the land wasn't something you owned, but something you belonged to. He had taught him the value of patience, the language of the seasons, and the quiet dignity of hard work. How could the man who had shared his very soul with him in this cabin cut him out of his legacy with such cold finality? Rocky, sensing the shift in his mood, padded over and rested his heavy head on Gary's knee. His amber eyes were full of a deep, knowing empathy. Gary stroked the dog's head, the familiar texture of his fur, a grounding comfort. He wasn't entirely alone. He had Rocky. His gaze fell upon the leather training dummy he had placed on the table. Beside it lay the small, folded note. For a moment, he felt a surge of bitterness, a toy and a note. The sum total of his inheritance. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the note and unfolded it. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was Arthur's. A familiar, steady script that had always felt like a bedrock in his life. The message was short, almost nonsensical. "Take Rocky to our thinking spot by the creek. He'll know what to do." Gary read the words twice, a frown creasing his brow. The thinking spot. Of course he knew where that was. It was a large, flat rock overlooking a gentle bend in Sparrow Creek, a secluded place where he and his grandfather had spent countless hours, talking, fishing, or just sitting in comfortable silence. But the rest of it made no sense. He'll know what to do. It felt like the rambling of an old man, a final, confusing instruction that led nowhere. What was Rocky supposed to do? It was a place, not a puzzle. For a moment, he considered tossing the note into the cold fireplace. His grief was too raw, his sense of betrayal too sharp to play along with some cryptic game. But then he looked at Rocky, who was watching him with an expectant tilt of his head, as if he understood the note perfectly. Gary's duty as a soldier had been ingrained in him, but his loyalty as a grandson ran even deeper. It was Arthur's last request. He had to see it through. "All right, boy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's go for a walk." And Miter, in 9. The Wev. The path to the creek was carpeted in a thick layer of fallen leaves that crunched under his boots. The late autumn air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. As they drew closer to the water, Rocky's demeanor changed. His tail began a slow, steady wag, and a low whine of excitement escaped his throat. He knew this path. He pulled eagerly on the leash, leading Gary toward the sound of the burbling creek. Their thinking spot was just as beautiful as he remembered. A massive, sun-warmed slab of granite sat at the water's edge, shaded by an ancient cottonwood tree whose leaves were a brilliant, fiery gold. The creek flowed past, clear and cold, the stones on its bed visible through the pristine water. Gary sat on the rock, the weight of the last few hours pressing down on him. He held the heavy leather dummy in his lap, turning it over and over. Rocky, however, was in no mood for quiet reflection. He nudged the dummy with his wet nose, then looked up at Gary, his body language a clear invitation to play. He barked once, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the quiet valley. A sad smile touched Gary's lips. "You really want this thing, don't you?" With a sigh, he gave in. He stood and hurled the dummy across the clearing. Rocky exploded into motion, a gray and white blur of joyful energy, and retrieved it flawlessly, dropping it at Gary's feet. They played for several minutes, the simple, repetitive act of throwing and retrieving a welcome distraction. For a moment, Gary could forget the will, the hurt, the confusion, and just share a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness with his dog. On the final throw, Rocky brought the dummy back, but instead of dropping it, he lay down on the rock and began to work on it. He wasn't tearing it apart like a lesser dog might. His actions were focused, his powerful jaws concentrating on one specific spot along a thick, hand-stitched seam. Gary watched, curious. A low growl of effort rumbled in Rocky's chest. The old waxed thread, weakened by years of use, began to strain. Gary heard a distinct snapping sound. The seam gave way. As it split open, something small and dark slipped out from a hidden pocket within the leather padding, clinking softly as it hit the surface of the rock. Gary knelt, his heart suddenly pounding. Lying there in the afternoon sun was a single, old-fashioned brass key. It was heavy, solid, and etched with a number. Rocky looked up from his prize, panting happily as if he had just completed the most important task of his life. Gary picked up the key, its cool metal a stark, undeniable reality in his hand. This was no accident. The sturdy toy, the cryptic note, the game of fetch, it had all been a plan. A message sent from beyond the grave. The confusion hadn't vanished, but it was now overshadowed by a profound and electrifying mystery. His grandfather hadn't left him with nothing. He had left him a key. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the rock, the dog, and the small piece of brass resting in the palm of Gary's hand. The creek continued its timeless journey, its gentle burbling the only sound in the sudden, profound silence. Gary stared at the key, his mind racing to connect the pieces of this impossible puzzle. The meticulously crafted training dummy, the cryptic note, the specific location, and now this. This was not a coincidence. This was a carefully constructed path. A shiver ran down his spine, a feeling that was part fear and part exhilaration. His grandfather hadn't been cruel or forgetful. He had been deliberate. Every action, every word, every seemingly unfair decision had been a single step in a plan that was only now beginning to reveal itself. Gary turned the key over. It was old, but clean, the brass worn to a soft gleam. Stamped into the head of the key was a 3-digit number, 247. His mind immediately jumped to the one place in Sparrow Creek where such a key and number would belong: the Montana Merchants Bank. It was an old institution, a stone fortress of secrets and security that had stood on Main Street since the town was founded. A safe deposit box. That had to be it. It was the only explanation that made sense. He slipped the key into his pocket, the weight of it both a burden and a promise. Rocky, who had been watching him with patient intensity, seemed to sense the shift in his resolve. The dog stood, stretched, and nudged Gary's hand with his nose as if to say, "Well, what are we waiting for?" The walk back to the cabin was a blur. Gary's thoughts were a whirlwind of questions. What could be in that box? Why go to all this trouble? Why couldn't his grandfather just have told him man to man? A familiar pang of hurt returned, softer this time, but still present. All this mystery felt like a game. And Gary wasn't in the mood for games. He was grieving. He was lost. Back inside the cold, dusty cabin, he began to pace. The floorboards creaked under his heavy boots. He pulled the key from his pocket and placed it on the table, right next to the note. A key and a command. What if it was nothing? Just some old documents, a forgotten keepsake with no real value. What if the hope that was now flickering to life inside him was just setting him up for another, deeper disappointment? The thought was paralyzing. Maybe it was better not to know, to just accept the hand he'd been dealt and try to move on. He sank into the old armchair, burying his face in his hands. The silence of the cabin pressed in on him. He felt the familiar weight of Rocky's head on his knee. He looked down into those steady amber eyes. There was no doubt in them, only a quiet, unwavering trust. Rocky believed in him, and by extension, he seemed to believe in the path Arthur had laid out. "What do you think, boy?" Gary whispered, his voice hoarse. "Is this some wild goose chase? Am I crazy for even thinking about it?" In response, Rocky lifted his head and let out a single, soft woof. Then, he gently nudged the hand that was closest to the key on the table. It was all the encouragement Gary needed. This journey, this test, it wasn't just his, it was theirs. His grandfather had included Rocky for a reason. Arthur had always said you could judge a man's character by how he treated his dog. Perhaps this was the final judgment. With a newfound determination, Gary stood up, pocketed the key and the note, and grabbed his truck keys. "All right, Grandpa," he said to the empty room. "I'll play your game. Let's see where it leads." The drive into Sparrow Creek was filled with a nervous energy. The familiar storefronts and friendly faces he passed on the street seemed to belong to a different world, one of simple, uncomplicated truths. His own reality had suddenly become a labyrinth. The Montana Merchants Bank was an imposing building of granite and carved oak, a relic from the state's mining boom. It looked like it was built to last forever and to keep its secrets just as long. Taking a deep breath, Gary walked in, Rocky healing perfectly at his side. The bank was quiet, the air cool and still. A young woman with a professional but kind smile looked up from behind the teller counter. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Gary's mouth felt dry. He felt conspicuous, as if everyone could see the secret key he was clutching in his pocket. "Yes," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have a key. I believe it might be for a safe deposit box here." He placed the brass key on the marble countertop. The teller picked it up, her expression politely neutral as she examined the number. "Box 247, she read. "Do you have an account with us, Mr. Wilson?" "Gary Wilson. My grandfather was Arthur Wilson." Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. Everyone knew Arthur. "Of course. Let me just check the records." She disappeared for a moment, and the seconds stretched into an eternity. Gary's doubts began to creep back in. What if it was a mistake? A key to a different box? From a different time? The teller returned, holding a large, leather-bound ledger. "This is an older account," she said, running her finger down a page. "But yes, here it is. Box 247. The account holder is Arthur Wilson, and you are listed as the sole beneficiary, with full access granted upon his passing." She looked up at him. "If you'll follow me, Mr. Wilson, I'll have our vault manager assist you." He sups. Relief washed over Gary so intensely he felt lightheaded. It was real. He followed the teller through a polished gate and down a quiet hallway to a massive circular steel door. A stern-looking older man, the vault manager, met them there. He nodded curtly at Gary and began the process of opening the vault. With a series of loud, satisfying clicks and the smooth spin of a large wheel, the heavy door swung inward, revealing the inner sanctum. The vault was colder than the rest of the bank, a silent, climate-controlled world of polished steel and numbered doors. It was a library of secrets. The manager led him down an aisle and stopped in front of a small, unassuming drawer marked 247. "Bank key first," the manager said, inserting a long silver key into the top lock and turning it. He then stepped back. "Now yours." Gary's hand was steady as he stepped forward. He slid the old brass key into the bottom lock. It fit perfectly. He turned it, and with a final, solid thunk, the lock disengaged. The path his grandfather had laid out for him had just opened. The vault manager led Gary to a small, private room furnished with nothing more than a simple table and 2 chairs. The air was still and quiet, the silence broken only by the soft click of the door closing behind him. He was alone with the long, rectangular metal box. For a moment, he just looked at it, his reflection a distorted, wavering image on the polished surface. It was cold to the touch, heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. He took a deep, steadying breath and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, were 2 items. The first was a thick, official-looking folder tied with a simple string. The second was a sealed, cream-colored envelope. On its front, in his grandfather's familiar hand, were 2 words, for Gary: the facts or the feelings. He decided he needed the facts first. His hands trembled slightly as he untied the string on the folder and opened it. The top document was dense with legal language, but a few key phrases leaped out at him, stark and undeniable against the heavy paper. Deed of ownership. The property described was a parcel of 40 acres located in Sparrow Creek Valley, County of Gallatin, State of Montana, commonly known as Spring Creek Meadow. And under the line marked Grantee was his own name, Gary Wilson. He read it again, and then a third time. His mind struggled to accept what his eyes were seeing. Spring Creek Meadow. It wasn't just any piece of land. It was the heart of the farm, the place where the valley's lifeblood bubbled up from the earth in a series of pristine, ice-cold springs. It was the most beautiful, the most vital, the most sacred part of his grandfather's world. And it was his. The cold emptiness that had taken root in his heart at the will reading was suddenly flooded with a disorienting, overwhelming warmth. It wasn't a dismissal. It was a gift beyond measure. But why? He carefully set the deed aside and picked up the envelope. His fingers fumbled with the seal, his heart pounding against his ribs. He unfolded the pages within and began to read the last words his grandfather would ever speak to him. "My dear Gary, if you are reading this, then it means two things. First, that an old man's foolish plan actually worked, and second, that you have passed my final test. Forgive me for the theatrics, son, and forgive me for the hurt I know the will must have caused you. It was the only way I could think of to make sure our family's heart fell into the right hands. You see, the world is changing, not for the better, I fear. Men in suits from faraway cities look at our valley, and they don't see the beauty or the history. They see a resource to be bottled up and sold. I've seen it coming for years. They will come for the water, Gary, and I couldn't bear the thought of our spring, your grandmother Eleanor's favorite place on earth, ending up on a corporate balance sheet. I love both of my grandsons. David is a smart boy, with a good head for business. He will make the farm profitable in ways I never could. But his eyes see the value of $1. Your eyes, Gary, you see the value of a sunset. You understand that a legacy is more than just land and money. It's the story the land tells. David would have fought to get the best price for the meadow. You are the only one who would fight to protect the meadow itself. That is why I had to create this test. I have entrusted this box and its contents to my old friend, Mr. Peterson, the manager at the bank. He has my instructions to grant you access once he has verified your identity, and you have presented the key. He is a good man and can be trusted with this secret. And that brings me to the key itself. I know the will must have made you feel like you were worth no more than a dog toy. That was part of the test. That leather dummy was my final message to you. I stitched it myself, with waxed thread and thick hide. I made it strong enough that only a dog with true heart and persistence could ever break it open. A dog like Rocky. In these last few years, I've often said that I have two grandsons living with me. One who walks on two legs, and one who walks on four. I trust you both to be the guardians of the creek. Your loyalty to that dog, and his to you, is the kind of bond that can't be bought or sold. It's the kind of bond that understands the value of protecting something precious. The deed is legally sound, registered decades ago. The meadow is yours. What you do with it now is up to you. My only wish is that you protect it, for Eleanor, for me, and for all the generations to come who will need a place to find peace by the water. You are a good man, Gary. Better than you know. I love you, Grandpa Arthur. The pages fell from Gary's numb fingers. Tears streamed down his face, hot and silent. They were not tears of grief, but of a profound, soul-shaking understanding. The hurt, the anger, the feeling of betrayal, it all dissolved, washed away by the truth. He hadn't been cast aside. He had been chosen. He had been trusted with the most important task of all. He picked up the letter and read it again. The words, a balm on his wounded spirit. He finally understood the strange looks, the sad pity in Mr. Henderson's eyes. He understood the bizarre inheritance, the cryptic note. It was all a performance, a grand, final lesson from the man who had taught him everything. A lesson in loyalty, in purpose, and in a love so deep it reached across the veil of death itself. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He gathered the deed and the other documents, his movements slow and deliberate. When he placed them back in the cold metal box, they no longer felt like just paper. They felt like a sacred trust. A new weight settled onto his shoulders, but it was not a burden. It was the firm, steady weight of purpose. He closed the lid, the soft click echoing in the silent room. He was no longer a disinherited grandson. He was the guardian of the creek. Gary stepped out of the Montana Merchants Bank and into the bright, crisp afternoon. The world outside felt different now, or perhaps he was the one who had changed. The weight in his pocket where the brass key now rested was a constant, tangible reminder of the solemn duty that had been passed to him. The grief for his grandfather was still there, a deep and steady ache, but it was no longer tangled with the sharp sting of betrayal. It had been replaced by a quiet, fierce sense of purpose. He walked toward his truck, his stride more measured, his shoulders set with a resolve he hadn't felt since his days in the military. Rocky was waiting in the passenger seat, his head perked up, watching the entrance intently. As soon as Gary opened the driver's side door, the dog's tail began to thump a steady rhythm against the seat. He whined softly, not with anxiety, but with a kind of recognition. He could sense the change in Gary, the new steel in his spine, the clarity that had replaced the fog of sorrow. Gary reached over and scratched behind the dog's ears. "It's okay, boy," he said, his voice calmer than it had been all day. I think I finally understand." Before he could start the engine, a voice called his name from across the street. "Gary! Hey, Gary! Wait up!" It was David. He was jogging across Main Street, waving, a broad, relieved smile on his face. It was the first genuine smile Gary had seen from him since their grandfather had fallen ill. Behind him, another man stepped out of the Sparrow Creek Diner. He was tall and lean, dressed in a tailored gray suit and polished city shoes that looked utterly out of place against the rustic backdrop of the town. "I was just about to head out to the farm to find you," David said, his voice breathless with excitement. "You are not going to believe the news. Our problems are over. And plays." "What are you talking about?" Gary asked, his newfound calm putting him on guard. "This is Mr. Thompson," David said, gesturing to the man in the suit who had just joined them. Mr. Thompson had a politician's smile, wide and practiced, but it didn't quite reach his cool, calculating blue eyes. He extended a hand to Gary. "A pleasure to meet you, Gary," Thompson said, his handshake firm and brief. "I'm with Aquapure Corporation." Gary didn't take his eyes off him. Aquapure. The name sent a small jolt through him, an echo of his grandfather's warning in the letter. Men in suits from faraway cities. "David has been telling me all about your family's impressive history here," Thompson continued smoothly. "A truly remarkable legacy." David could barely contain his excitement. "They want to buy the farm, Gary, the whole thing. They made an offer that is life-changing. It's enough to clear all of Grandpa's debts, pay off the inheritance taxes, and set me up for the rest of my life. It saves us. It saves everything." Gary's face remained a neutral mask. He looked from his cousin's beaming face to Thompson's slick smile. He could see the whole picture with perfect clarity. David, drowning in debt and seeing only the numbers, had found a lifeline. Thompson, seeing only a resource to be exploited, had found an easy target. "They love the place," David went on, oblivious to Gary's silence. "Especially the area around the creek. Thompson says the water quality is some of the best in the country. They're going to build a state-of-the-art bottling plant there." At the mention of the creek, Rocky, who had been sitting quietly, let out a low, barely audible growl from inside the truck. His ears were flat against his head, his gaze fixed on Thompson. Thompson chuckled. "Your dog seems protective. A fine animal." It had sighed. "He's a good judge of character," Gary said, his voice even. He let the silence hang for a moment before he spoke again. "You can't sell the whole farm, David." David's smile faltered. He looked confused. "What? Of course I can. You heard the will. It's mine. You can sell the main house and the 260 acres around it," Gary stated, his voice calm but unyielding. "But you can't sell Spring Creek Meadow. It's not mine far. He saw a flicker of something in Thompson's eyes, a sharpening of his focus. David just looked baffled. "What are you talking about, the meadow? That's part of the farm." "No," Gary said, his gaze locking with his cousin's. "It isn't. It's not yours to sell." He paused, letting the words sink in. "It's mine." For a second, David just stared at him. Then, he let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Yours? What are you talking about? Did you hit your head? Grandpa left you the cabin and a dog toy." The anger that flashed in David's eyes was raw and real, fueled by the financial desperation he had been living with for months. "Is this some kind of joke? Some pathetic attempt to get back at me because you felt left out? I'm trying to save this family from bankruptcy, and you're standing here telling fairy tales? It's not a fairy tale, Gary said, his voice dangerously quiet. Then what is it? David demanded, his voice rising. Some old story Grandpa told you when you were a kid? You think that will hold up against a legal will? I have a multi-million-dollar deal on the line, Gary. A deal that saves our grandfather's name from ruin. Don't you dare try to sabotage this out of jealousy. Gary felt a surge of his own anger, but he pushed it down, channeling it into cold resolve. This was the moment his grandfather had prepared him for. The moment of the test. He held up the thick folder he had carried from the bank. It's more than a story, David, he said. It's a legally registered deed, and it says that the 40 acres of Spring Creek Meadow belong to me. The cousins stood facing each other on the quiet main street, the gap between them wider than the few feet of pavement that separated them. It was a chasm of different values, different dreams, and a family history that was far more complicated than either of them had ever known. The battle line had been drawn. The confrontation on Main Street left a bitter taste in Gary's mouth. David, his face flushed with anger and disbelief, had thrown the folder of documents back at him. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer, Gary," he'd snarled, before turning sharply and escorting a silent, watchful Mr. Thompson to his car. Gary was left standing on the sidewalk, the excited buzz of the town seeming to fade into a dull roar in his ears. The deed in his hand felt both immensely powerful and incredibly fragile. He knew it was real, but in the face of David's fury and Thompson's cold ambition, he felt a sudden, desperate need for something more. He needed an ally. He needed someone who had known his grandparents, not just as landowners, but as people. His mind immediately went to one person, Clara Jenkins. The Sparrow Creek Public Library was Gary's favorite building in town. It was a quiet sanctuary built of the same dark, local stone as the bank. But where the bank felt like a fortress, the library felt like a home. The air inside smelled of aging paper, lemon polish, and the faint, comforting scent of brewing tea. Rocky's paws were silent on the thick carpet as he followed Gary past the reading tables to the main desk. Behind the desk sat a woman who seemed as much a part of the library as the books themselves. Clara Jenkins was in her late 70s, her white hair pinned up in a neat bun that somehow managed to look both elegant and practical. Her eyes, magnified by silver-rimmed glasses, were bright and incredibly sharp, missing nothing. She had been his grandmother Eleanor's closest friend, a living repository of the valley's history. She looked up as they approached, and a warm, genuine smile lit up her face, erasing years of worry from her features. "Gary Wilson, my goodness. It is so good to see you, child," she said, her voice soft but clear. Her gaze then dropped to Rocky, who sat patiently at Gary's side. "And who is this handsome fellow?" Eleanor would have adored him. "This is Rocky," Gary said. "He's a good boy." "I can see that," she replied, her smile unwavering. Then, her perceptive eyes returned to Gary's face, and her expression softened with concern. "But you are not here for a social call. You have your grandfather's worry etched all over your face. What troubles you?" Without a word, Gary placed the folder on the circulation desk. He laid out the deed to Spring Creek Meadow and the letter from his grandfather, his hands resting on the worn paper as if to draw strength from them. He told her everything, from the reading of the will to the confrontation with David just minutes before. Clara listened intently, her gaze moving from Gary's face to the documents. She picked up the deed, her fingers tracing the familiar legal phrasing. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. It was not a smile of surprise, but of deep, fond recognition. "Oh, Eleanor," she whispered, her voice thick with affection. "You clever, clever woman. I wondered if this day would ever come." "Then, it's real?" Gary asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's legal?" "As real and legal as the mountains themselves," Clara confirmed, her eyes twinkling. "I was with her at the lawyer's office in Helena when she had this drawn up, just after your father was born. She never fully trusted banks or corporations, and she certainly didn't trust fate. Arthur owned the farm, but Eleanor always said the water was a gift from God, not an asset on a ledger. She used her own inheritance to purchase the meadow outright and put it in trust for the grandchild she knew would have the heart to protect it. As life, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled Gary's knees, washed over him. He wasn't crazy. This wasn't a mistake. It was a legacy, a plan set in motion 60 years ago by a woman with incredible foresight. "Your grandmother knew this day might come," Clara said, her expression turning serious. She saw how the world was changing. She knew that to fight men like this, Mr. Thompson, you need more than just legal right on your side. You need history. You need the truth. It's so. It's fiery. Her eyes gleamed with a new purpose. "Wait right here." She disappeared into the library's archives, a maze of tall shelves and map cabinets in the back. Rocky lifted his head, watched her go, and then rested it back on his paws with a soft sigh. A few minutes later, Clara returned, her arms laden with a collection of fragile, oversized folders and rolled-up documents. She carefully spread them out on a large, sunlit reading table. It was an arsenal of history. First, she unrolled a geological survey map of the valley from the 1942nd. It was old, the lines hand-drawn, the paper brittle. "Look here," she said, her finger tracing a network of faint blue lines that all converged at a single point. "This is Spring Creek Meadow. It's not just a creek, Gary. It's the source. All these other streams, the underground water tables that feed every farm from here to the county line, they all begin right here. What happens at the source affects everyone downstream." Next, she opened a folder of yellowed newspaper clippings from the Sparrow Creek Chronicle. She pointed to one from a blistering hot summer in the 1952nd. The headline read, "Wilson Spring Saves Valley Flocks." The article described a devastating drought, where Arthur and Eleanor had opened their land, allowing their neighbors to water their livestock from the only spring that hadn't run dry. Another clipping showed a picture of his grandparents receiving a Community Stewardship Award. Finally, she opened a more modern folder, this one filled with articles she had printed from the internet. They were from small towns in Wyoming, in Colorado, in Utah. The headlines were chillingly similar. "Aquapure pledges growth, leaves town with dry wells. The real cost of a bottling plant. How one community lost its water. Broken promises. Inside Aquapure's rural expansion strategy." "This is their pattern," Clara said, her voice low and grim. "They find a community that's struggling financially. They promise jobs, tax revenue, a bright new future. They get the local leaders on their side, secure the water rights for a fraction of their worth, and then they pump the aquifer faster than it can replenish. When the wells start to go dry and the profits dip, they shut down the plant and move on, leaving the town to deal with the ecological devastation. They aren't building a factory, Gary. They are mining for water." Gary stared at the mountain of evidence before him. He had come to the library seeking validation for a single piece of paper. He was leaving with the full, undeniable weight of his family's legacy and a clear, terrifying picture of the enemy he was facing. This was no longer just about his inheritance. It was about the future of his entire community. He looked at Clara, his heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. She placed a warm, steadying hand on his arm. "Your grandmother always said you had the heart of a fighter, hidden under all that quiet. She knew you wouldn't back down when it mattered. Now, go and fight for her." The news of Gary's claim to Spring Creek Meadow spread through the valley like a wildfire in a dry season. In a small town like Sparrow Creek, secrets were a currency, and this one was gold. But the story that reached the ears of his neighbors was not the one Gary knew to be true. It was a twisted, simpler version, a narrative skillfully shaped by a voice that was not his own. The change was subtle at first, a conversation that would stop abruptly when he walked into the general store, the friendly waves from passing trucks that were now hesitant or absent altogether. Then came the whispers. He heard them at the feed co-op, Two ranchers talking in low voices, their glances darting his way. "Holding the whole deal hostage," one of them muttered. "Trying to squeeze more money out of it. Selfish, if you ask me." Each cold shoulder, each averted gaze, was a small cut. These were people he'd known his whole life, men his grandfather had shared coffee with for 50 years. He had expected a fight from Aquapure, but he hadn't been prepared for a fight with his own community. He felt a profound sense of isolation creeping in, a feeling he hadn't experienced so acutely since his first days in a war zone overseas. Rocky seemed to feel it too. The German shepherd, usually relaxed and confident on their trips to town, now stayed closer to Gary's side, his body a solid, protective barrier. His amber eyes scanned the faces of the people they passed, a low, quiet rumble, occasionally vibrating in his chest when someone stared a moment too long. He was a silent defender against a threat he couldn't see, but could clearly sense in the tense set of his owner's shoulders. The architect of this campaign of whispers made no secret of his work. Gary saw Mr. Thompson frequently. He was a constant presence in town, buying rounds of coffee for the business owners at the diner, talking earnestly with town council members on the courthouse steps. He spoke of progress, of jobs, of a modern future, for a valley struggling with the realities of modern agriculture. He was charismatic and convincing, and he painted a very clear picture. Aquapure was the future, and Gary Wilson was the past. A stubborn, greedy man, standing in the way of prosperity for everyone. The pressure was immense, a constant, grinding weight. There were moments, late at night, in the quiet of the cabin, when doubt would creep in. Was he wrong to stand in the way? David was his family, and he was in real financial trouble. The town needed jobs. Was his sentimental attachment to a piece of land, a promise to a dead man, worth more than the tangible future of his community? It was on a drive back from one of these isolating trips to town that his doubt was burned away by a cold, sharp certainty. He was on the county road, about a mile from the farm's main entrance, when he saw it. Tucked just off the road, partially shielded by a thicket of lodgepole pines, was a sleek, black rental car. The sun glinted off the windshield, but he could just make out the silhouette of a single person in the driver's seat. Thompson. Gary slowed his truck, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Thompson wasn't doing anything. He was just sitting there, parked, his car pointed towards the rolling hills that led to Spring Creek Meadow. He was watching. In an instant, Gary was no longer a grieving grandson. He was a soldier again. His training, long dormant, flooded his senses. This wasn't a casual stop. This was reconnaissance. This was an enemy studying the terrain, assessing the objective, planning his next move. The lingering scent of coffee from the diner, the friendly handshakes, that was the public front. This was the truth. A predator, silently watching from the shadows. The cold knot in Gary's stomach was not fear. It was the familiar, chilling clarity of recognizing a threat. He kept driving, not wanting to reveal that he had spotted him, but he watched in his rearview mirror. A few minutes later, Thompson's car pulled back onto the road and headed back toward town. The encounter couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but it had changed everything. His grandfather's letter had warned him about men in suits, but it was this image, the silent car watching from the trees, that made the threat viscerally real. This was not a negotiation, it was a battle, and Thompson was not a man who played by the rules. That evening, Gary didn't stay in the cabin. He took Rocky and walked to Spring Creek Meadow. The sun was setting, painting the vast Montana sky in strokes of deep orange and purple. The air was cold and pure, and the only sound was the musical rush of the spring as it began its journey down the valley. This was the legacy. Not the whispers in town, not the contracts or the dollar signs. This was it. The clean water, the ancient cottonwoods, the quiet promise of life. He knelt by the water's edge and dipped his hand in. It was achingly cold, a shock to the system that felt clarifying. He looked at his reflection, the face of a man who was tired, who was being pushed from all sides, but whose eyes held a new, harder light. The pressure, the isolation, the rumors, they hadn't weakened him. They had stripped away his doubts, leaving only the raw, unshakable core of his purpose. Rocky came and sat beside him, leaning his solid weight against Gary's shoulder. They sat in silence, two guardians watching over the land as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. The town could turn its back on him. His cousin could despise him. Thompson could scheme in the shadows. It didn't matter. They didn't understand, but he did, and he would not fail. The shadow that had fallen over the meadow had not instilled fear. It had solidified his resolve into something as hard and enduring as the mountains themselves. Night fell over Sparrow Creek Valley like a thick, velvet curtain. The moon was a sliver of silver, offering little light, and the stars in the vast Montana sky seemed cold and distant. A profound silence settled over the land, a silence that felt heavy with unspoken threats. Inside the small cabin, Gary couldn't rest. The image of Thompson's car, a dark predator watching from the tree line, was seared into his mind. His military training had taught him one undeniable truth: an enemy doesn't scout a position unless they intend to act. He pulled on a dark jacket and sturdy boots, his movements quiet and deliberate. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "We're going on a walk." Rocky, who had been dozing by the cold fireplace, was on his feet in an instant. There was no playful tail wag, no excited yip. He seemed to understand the gravity of the mission, his posture alert, and his movements economical. He was no longer just a companion. He was a partner, ready for duty. They moved through the darkness like shadows, avoiding the open paths and sticking to the cover of the trees. The air was frigid, and their breath plumed in the faint moonlight. Gary's senses were on high alert, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind, registering in his mind. He was patrolling the fence line of Spring Creek Meadow, his eyes scanning the darkness for anything out of place. They had been walking for nearly an hour when it happened. They were approaching the northern edge of the property, near the dense aspen grove that shielded the primary source of the spring. Gary was about to continue along the fence, but Rocky stopped dead. His entire body went rigid, his head low, his nose twitching as he tasted the air. A low growl, more a vibration than a sound, rumbled deep in his chest. The fur along his spine bristled. He was not looking at the fence, but deeper into the property, towards the heart of the spring. "What is it, boy?" Gary whispered, immediately crouching down and placing a calming hand on the dog's back. He trusted his dog's instincts more than his own eyes. Rocky ignored the hand, taking a single, silent step forward, his focus absolute. He was a hunter who had found a scent. Gary followed his lead, moving from the cover of one tree to the next, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. As they drew closer, he began to hear it. Voices, low and guttural, muffled by the trees and the gentle sound of the bubbling spring. He heard the clink of glass against rock. They found a vantage point behind a large, moss-covered boulder, not 50 yards from the source. Peering around the edge, Gary saw them. Two figures, their faces illuminated by the focused beams of headlamps. One was Thompson. The other was a stranger, a stocky man in practical outdoor gear, with bags of equipment at his feet. He was kneeling at the water's edge, siphoning water into a series of small glass vials. Gary's blood ran cold. They were trespassing, and they were taking samples. His grandfather's words from the letter echoed in his mind. "They will come for the water." He slowly, carefully, pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. His fingers felt clumsy with cold and adrenaline. He shielded the screen with his body, swiped to the camera, and hit record. The small red light was a beacon of defiance in the oppressive darkness. He held the phone steady, zooming in just enough to capture their faces and their actions clearly. The video recorded the stranger scooping a sample of sediment from the creek bed into a plastic bag. The date and time stamp, a silent digital witness in the corner of the screen. As he filmed, Their voices carried clearly in the still night air. "The water is clean, Thompson," the stranger said, his voice gravelly. "Extremely clean. The initial field tests are off the charts. The lab results will confirm it." Thompson let out an impatient sigh. "That's a problem. We need leverage. Find something. Some trace mineral we can flag as a potential contaminant with the EPA. Anything. If the water quality is too perfect, our public utility claim looks weak." Gary's stomach tightened. They weren't just taking samples. They were looking for a way to fabricate a flaw, to poison the well with lies if not with chemicals. "It's not going to matter," Thompson said, his voice dripping with condescending confidence. "Even if we can't discredit the water, our legal team in Helena is ready. We'll file a motion to challenge the validity of the deed, tie it up in probate court for years. The veteran will run out of money for lawyers long before we do. We'll bleed him dry. We will get this land, one way or another." The stranger nodded, packing his vials into a cushioned case. "Whatever you say, you're paying the bills." It was the smoking gun. Their entire strategy laid bare. It wasn't a legal fight. It was a war of attrition, and Gary had just captured it all. He continued to record as the two men packed their equipment, swept the area with their lights to make sure they'd left nothing behind, and then made their way back towards the road, their headlamps, two bouncing orbs of light, disappearing into the darkness. Gary waited, unmoving, for a full 10 minutes after they were gone, the silence of the meadow slowly returning. Finally, he stopped the recording. The video file was a small, glowing thumbnail on his screen. It was everything. He sank back behind the boulder, the adrenaline leaving him feeling shaky and cold. He looked down at Rocky, who was now sitting calmly beside him, the tension having melted from his body the moment the intruders had left. Gary wrapped his arms around his dog's powerful neck, burying his face in the thick, familiar fur. "You did it, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You found them. You heard them when I couldn't." Rocky whined softly and licked his face. In the cold, lonely darkness, under the watchful eyes of the mountains, the Guardian and his partner had found the fangs they needed to fight back. It wasn't luck. It was a bond of unwavering trust, a partnership between a man's resolve and a dog's profound, incorruptible instincts. The Sparrow Creek Town Hall was a historic building, its stone walls having absorbed the hopes and anxieties of the valley for over a century. Tonight, those walls seemed to strain under the pressure. The room was packed, a standing-room-only crowd that had split itself down the middle aisle as if by an invisible line. On one side sat the business owners, the younger residents, and those whose farms were struggling, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. They sat with David and Mr. Thompson. On the other side were the older farming families, the ranchers whose ancestors had settled this land, and a small group of environmental advocates from the county seat. They sat with Gary and Clara. Gary sat in the front row, the folder of historical documents on his lap. At his feet, Rocky lay in a perfect, quiet downstay, his presence a silent island of calm in a sea of tension. He seemed to understand the solemnity of the occasion, his gaze occasionally lifting to Gary's face as if for reassurance. The 5 members of the town council sat at a raised table at the front, looking overwhelmed. They were ordinary people, a hardware store owner, a high school teacher, a third-generation rancher, tasked with making a decision that would shape the valley's future forever. The mayor, a kind but flustered man named Jenkins, called the meeting to order. Thompson and David were invited to speak first. Thompson was masterful. He strode to the podium with the easy confidence of a man who has won 1,000 such arguments. With a slick presentation projected on a screen behind him, he spoke of progress and opportunity. He showed charts with upward trending lines, predicting job creation and tax revenues. He spoke of a new community center, of scholarships for local students, all funded by Aquapure. He painted a beautiful picture of a prosperous, revitalized Sparrow Creek, and he made it sound not just possible, but inevitable. Then, David spoke. His voice was less polished but held an emotional weight that resonated with many in the room. He spoke of the crushing debt, the rising cost of fuel and feed, the fear of watching a century of family history slip through his fingers into bankruptcy. "This deal isn't about selling out," he said, his voice thick with genuine desperation. "It's about survival. It's the only way to save my grandfather's farm." When he finished, a wave of sympathetic applause came from his side of the room. The challenge felt immense. Gary's heart pounded. He looked down at Rocky, who met his gaze with unwavering trust. It was time. "The council will now hear from Mr. Gary Wilson," the mayor announced. A tense quiet fell as Gary walked to the podium. He placed Clara's folder on the wooden surface, but left it closed. He didn't begin with accusations. He began with understanding. "I understand why this offer is so appealing," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I know our town is struggling, and I know my cousin David is carrying a heavy burden. I love this farm as much as he does." He then told them his story. He spoke of his grandfather, of the will, of the profound hurt of being left with nothing but what he thought was a simple dog toy. He told them about the cryptic note, the walk to the creek, and the moment of pure, simple joy playing fetch with Rocky. He described the snapped thread, the glint of brass on stone, and the discovery of the key. The room was utterly silent, captivated. "My grandfather's will wasn't about property," Gary continued, his voice gaining strength. "It was a test of character. He left me a key that could only be found through loyalty and love, because he knew that the person entrusted with our family's greatest treasure needed to have those qualities above all else." He opened the folder and held up the deed. "This is that treasure, Spring Creek Meadow. My grandmother Eleanor used her own inheritance to buy and protect this land 60 years ago, because she knew, as my grandfather did, that the spring is the heart of this valley. It is our history." He gestured to the copies of old newspapers Clara had given him. "It saved our neighbors during the Great Drought, and it is our future." He finally turned his gaze to Thompson, who was watching him with a look of bored condescension. "Aquapure has made many promises tonight, but what are their promises worth? What are their true intentions when they think no one is watching?" He pulled his phone from his pocket. "I believe the people of Sparrow Creek deserve to know. It's not Adhitensha." He connected the phone to the projector. The slick corporate logo of Aquapure was replaced by a grainy, dark video. A collective gasp went through the room. The footage was shaky, but the images were clear. Thompson and a stranger, trespassing in the dead of night, their faces illuminated by headlamps. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the figures took samples of soil and water. Then came the audio. Thompson's voice, clear and cold in the night air. "Find something, some trace mineral we can flag as a potential contaminant. Our lawyers believe we can bury the veteran in legal fees. Tie up the deed in court for years. He'll run out of money long before we do. We will get this land, one way or another." The video ended. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with shock and a slow-burning rage. The whispers started, no longer about Gary's greed, but about Thompson's treachery. Thompson's face was a mask of fury, his professional demeanor shattered, but the most dramatic reaction came from David. He was on his feet, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. He looked from the blank screen to Thompson, and then to Gary. The look on his face was one of sickening, profound realization. He had been a pawn, his desperation used as a tool by this man. Before the mayor could even call for order, David took a step into the aisle, facing the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was shaky, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was wrong," he said, the words costing him everything. "I was wrong. I was desperate, and I let this man and his company deceive me. I let them deceive all of us." He turned to face Gary, his expression one of deep, agonizing shame. "My grandfather's legacy, our family's legacy, is not for sale, not to men like this. I withdraw my support for this project, completely." That was the moment the battle was won. A wave of applause and shouts of support erupted from all corners of the room. The mayor banged his gavel, calling for the vote. It was a formality. One by one, each of the 5 council members spoke their decision into the microphone. No, no, absolutely not. No, no. The final bang of the gavel sealed it. The proposal was defeated. The room exploded in cheers and relief. Gary felt a hand on his leg and looked down. Rocky had lifted his head and was looking up at him, letting out a soft, happy whine. The tension had finally broken, and the valley's heart was safe. In the days following the fateful town meeting, a profound quiet settled over Sparrow Creek Valley. It was not the tense, watchful quiet of before, but a deep, peaceful calm, like the air after a cleansing rain. Mr. Thompson and his Aquapure Corporation vanished as quickly as they had arrived, their slick rental cars and broken promises leaving nothing behind but a cautionary tale that would be told for generations. The change in the town was immediate and palpable. The cold shoulders and suspicious glances that had followed Gary were replaced with warm smiles and firm, appreciative handshakes. Old ranchers who had been swayed by Thompson's talk of progress now tipped their hats to him in a gesture of respect. The owner of the general store insisted his coffee was on the house. The community, having been pushed to the brink, had looked into the heart of what it valued most and chosen to protect it. They had chosen the land over the ledger. The most important change, however, happened not in the town, but on the front porch of the old Wilson farmhouse. A few days after the meeting, Gary found David sitting there, staring out at the fields. His ambition had almost cost them. He looked humbled, the aggressive confidence drained from him, leaving behind a weary quiet. Gary sat down beside him, and for a long time, neither man spoke. Rocky, sensing the fragile peace, lay down at their feet, his head resting on Gary's boot, but his tail giving a soft thump whenever David shifted. "I'm sorry, Gary," David finally said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was so buried in debt, so terrified of being the one who lost this farm, I couldn't see anything else. I saw the land as a problem to be solved with a spreadsheet. You and Grandpa, you always saw it as a home. Here. He put you in a tough spot, David," Gary replied, his voice full of a grace he hadn't known he possessed. "And you were trying to do what you thought was right to save it. But I was wrong," David admitted. "He didn't trust me with the meadow, and he was right not to. I would have sold it. I would have sold our family's heart for a quick fix." He finally turned to look at Gary, his eyes filled with a shame that was more powerful than any apology. "Can you forgive me?" "There's nothing to forgive," Gary said, meeting his cousin's gaze. "We're family, and the farm needs both of us. It needs your business sense, and it needs my stubbornness." A small, genuine smile touched David's lips for the first time in weeks. In that moment, on that porch, the rift that had torn their family apart was healed. It was not just a truce, but a new beginning. They started talking, first about the immediate debts, then about the future. David's practical mind, now freed from desperation, began to align with Gary's vision. They spoke of sustainable crops, of partnering with Clara to establish a formal conservation trust for the meadow, of creating a future for the farm that was both profitable and pure. They were a team. Weeks turned into a month. The last of the golden leaves fell from the cottonwoods, and the air grew sharp with the promise of winter. The work was just beginning, but it was joyful work. Gary and David became a familiar sight, walking the property together, their conversations a blend of soil analysis and storytelling. The community rallied around them. Volunteers helped clear old irrigation ditches, and the hardware store owner donated heritage seeds for a new community garden to be planted in the spring. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the snow-dusted peaks of the Gallatin Range, Gary took Rocky for a walk. They followed the familiar path down to Spring Creek Meadow, to their thinking spot by the water. The world was awash in the soft, golden light of dusk. Gary sat on the large, flat rock, the same spot where this impossible journey had truly begun. In his hand, he held the old leather training dummy. He had spent a quiet afternoon in the cabin's workshop, carefully restitching the seam that Rocky's persistence had torn open. He had used his grandfather's old leatherworking tools, his stitches neat and strong. The dummy was whole again, its scar a faint, silvery line that told a story. It was no longer just a toy, it was a symbol of a legacy that had been broken and then mended, stronger than before. He looked out at the water, which flowed clear and strong over the smooth stones. He finally understood the full depth of his grandfather's wisdom. The will hadn't been designed to tear them apart. It had been designed to force them to discover what truly held them together. The true inheritance wasn't the 40 acres of land, it was the responsibility for it. It was the purpose he felt. A quiet, steady sense of belonging that ran deeper than any legal deed. Rocky moved closer, leaning his solid weight against Gary's side, a familiar, comforting presence. Gary wrapped an arm around his loyal companion, burying his face in the thick, gray and white fur of his neck. "He knew, boy," Gary whispered into the quiet evening. "All along, he knew it had to be you. You held the key the whole time." Rocky looked up, his amber eyes seeming to understand everything. He had been the catalyst, the guide, the Guardian's faithful partner. The sun dipped below the mountains, but here, by the water, the light seemed to linger. Gary held the mended toy in his hand, a simple piece of leather and thread that contained their entire story. He was not alone, he was a guardian, and his watch had just begun. Sometimes the most profound legacies are not written on paper, but are carried in the heart. It's a truth we see every day in the loyal companions who walk beside us, reminding us that the greatest treasures are not possessions we own, but responsibilities we choose to protect. What moments of quiet loyalty from an animal have touched your life? Your stories are what make this community so special, and we invite you to share them below. By sharing this video and subscribing to Voice of Paws, you help us celebrate these incredible bonds. Our next tale of trust and friendship is ready for you now. Just click on the video appearing on your screen to continue the journey with us.